Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual Gallier gathering. We are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier historic houses. I'm Dr. Anastasia Scott. I have the title of Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. And Gallier gatherings are being offered to you all for free in this virtual environment. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership helps with sponsoring programs such as this. If you join now, our membership is good through the end of June 2021. 19, we are offering a student membership for $25 a year. I just want to share a little bit about our museums. Hermann-Grima and Gallier historic houses preserve and present architecture and history of New Orleans from 19th century construction of the houses through the mid-20th century. We aim to be an example of best practices in stewardship, both in architectural preservation and in inclusive education. We continually expand our interpretation of both houses, including the lives of the enslaved peoples who lived and worked in the houses. Our engaging programming for both youth and adults inspires an interest in the preservation for future. At any given time, between 1831 and 1865, there were more people of African descent living and working in the houses than people of European descent. Because of this, we are intentional about expanding the discussions of the lives of the enslaved and related topics. For this talk, From the Lowcountry to the Bayou, Dr. Conyers will talk about the history of barbecue and how it is connected to the enslaved people in America. Dr. Howard Conyers is a rocket scientist and pitmaster from Paxville, South Carolina. He's also the founder of the Conyers Family Barbecue, From the Lowcountry to the Bayou, and Gumbo Jubilee. After over 20 years of learning history of the South and a PhD in mechanical engineering, he has worked for NASA for over 10 years. He officially launched his Conyers Family Barbecue LLC in 2016 to be a pitmaster, cultural food educator, and STEM expert to the New Orleans area. Doc's emphasis quickly became cultural educational dinners, media productions, and demonstrations. In 2018, Dr. Conyers hosted and co-produced PBS Digital Studios show, Nourish. It was awarded the Telly Award and the Weeby nominee in its pilot season. Professionally, he earned the NASA Space Technology Innovation Award and the Black Engineer of the Year Award, Modern Day Technology Leader. For his combined interests, Dr. Conyers was one of 25 people recognized as a Southerner of the Year by Southern Living in 2018. In 2018, he was also presented with the key to the city of Manning, the town in South Carolina where he is from. Dr. Howard Conyers speaks on the topics that reflect a commitment to educating the community about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, American barbecue, Black farmers, African-American culture in the rural South, and Southern foodways. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Howard Conyers.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. I really appreciate the introduction. So I'm thankful to have this opportunity to come and speak to you all today. And whenever you have the presentation ready, then we'll go from there. So from the Lowcountry to the Bayou is what I'm gonna call this talk today, and hopefully I will give you a lot to think about in terms of barbecue, as well as I'm gonna do a little bit of brief introduction on another Southern food tradition, as well as it ties into Louisiana towards the end. Just a kind of brief intro, but most of the talk will be on around barbecue. Next slide. Just so you could get a little bit of my background per se, in my own community, I could trace my barbecue lineage probably just as close as I can my own personal genealogy, and I could trace the barbecue around 90-something years. I grew up in a little small community called Paxville, which is less than about really 5 miles from where my family was enslaved, in an area called Sammy Swamp, South Carolina. I've been cooking whole hog barbecue for over 34 years, or been around it. So, but you probably say you look kind of young with cooking for that period of time, but I've been around it honestly since I was around 4 years old. The whole process, watching my father, uncles, and some other men in my community cooking whole hog barbecue. A lot of these men were black farmers, or they had some ties to black farm, black land ownership. For the past probably 5 or 6 years, I really took my knowledge as a pit master, and I started going into understanding the history of barbecue, because I realized in the work of being a pit master, the story of enslaved Africans was not being told. And I thought when I started looking into the literature, a lot of the literature that I talked about was a lot of the literature that was available. A lot of things were left out, and I knew a lot of the information from oral history. So I thought it was imperative for me to actually share that particular history. In terms of actually cooking barbecue, I have pretty much cooked every animal whole in the American South, from the hog, goat, lamb, turkey, chicken, and a cow. Not many people have cooked the whole cow in this country in probably 100 and so plus years. And one of my recent accomplishments, telling some of the stories across the South and combining food science and culture, was a digital show I did with PBS called Nourish. And if you're interested, the series is still available on YouTube. And my day job is a rocket scientist. What is barbecue? Well, barbecue to me is always the general practice of cooking whole animals. A lot of people like to think of barbecue as like grilling, but in the community where I come from in South Carolina, it was always generally a whole hog. And with this image kind of embodies to me what is barbecue. In my community, when we was cooking barbecue, we had this particular phrase that we would always use when we was cooking barbecue, and we would say this phrase called "pour the coals to it." And what that means was, when we was cooking barbecue, we would burn wood down to the side in another container or on the ground, and we would take hot embers from underneath there and shovel it into a pit. What you see here is a man shoveling coals into a pit, and in that pit is a representation of every animal that I have cooked in my life, starting with the hog, transitioning to a goat and a lamb, which is representative of the same animal, turkey, chicken, and the bottom is a whole cow, and that's the biggest animal I have cooked in my life to this day. So next slide. Why I really found a lot of interest in barbecue, I think moving to New Orleans was very pivotal for me in actually seeing these traditions, not necessarily barbecue, but seeing another tradition that I really enjoy and I would have a lot of respect for, the Black Mexican Indian culture. And seeing the reverence and the level of respect in this particular culture, I realized that I have my own culture that I could particularly celebrate. And in looking at it, I did not realize how significant, how far back it went into American history. So looking at barbecue, I started doing some research, and pictorially, I started asking myself some questions after I realized it was tied directly into slavery. Across the American South, barbecue was in various states. And when I looked at these early pits, a lot of these pits look very similar and identical in construction. It was in the ground, there was long trenches. They were about 18 to 24 inches deep, even though the literature doesn't necessarily say that, except for in very scarce cases. But due to my father sharing old history with me and also teaching me how to cook barbecue from when he learned in the ground, he always said the pit was between 18 and 24 inches deep. So you look at this picture here, you're looking at 4 images across the South. You have Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. And if you look at these images really closely, all these barbecue pits look pretty identical. They have whole animal carcasses, and they have generally a black person cooking that meat. And the reason they had whole animal carcasses during this time of when they were doing barbecue, you couldn't just go to the store and actually get, or go to Smithfield's or whoever major large animal processors to get an animal. You had to go to your local farmer, or if you farm, you had your own pig pen to get animals. So when they get ready to do a barbecue, they was slaughtering and butchering their own animals. So this is why you see a lot of whole carcasses. And when they did that, they did the whole animal. Next one. These other images are some other states. I didn't go to every state, but I wanted to kind of give you a cross section. You have Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. And what you will see here, they're also cooking in earth dug pits. And when I saw these images, I asked myself, why were all these pits, all these pits almost look identical, and how that knowledge was shared culturally, because during those time periods, African Americans weren't allowed to read or write. And so there was no cookbooks or anything, things of that sort. So I questioned myself, like, why do all these barbecue pits look alike? And so I really started looking at history, agriculture, and look at history in the South. And so when we go on, you'll kind of see like how I start putting together this basis of how I think barbecue traveled across the South. Before enslaved Africans were brought to the United States or North America, this area was called Turtle Island. And in the Canada area, just around the Hudson Bay, the Indians and the indigenous communities would call North America Turtle Island, and the tail would be like Mexico, and the head would be just to the left of Hudson Bay. Then to the right, you saw the transatlantic slave trade. And in particular, what I want to point out about the transatlantic slave trade that you may not realize, even though we have a lot of people in North America, the largest population of enslaved Africans was actually taken to Brazil. And actually North America was one of the smallest in percentage basis of the amount of people that was actually brought over, that was actually left the continent of West Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. During the slave trade, you had these old cities, and some of the oldest cities in the country, they was up and down the East Coast, from St. Augustine, Florida, which was a Spanish territory, to like the Virginia area was the British, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, and Savannah. And the later three is partly due to how the country grew, but also, and this is even before the country, because New Orleans wasn't part of the United States initially when slave trade occurred. So, but I wanted to put it in here because it's very important to how the United States of America grew, and it ties the whole story together from the Lowcountry to the Bayou. The growth of the South. How did the growth of the South really transform and change this knowledge of barbecue knowledge? You have to understand when the enslaved Africans were brought to North America, the first slaves were brought to Virginia, and then they were growing tobacco at that time. But then later on, enslaved Africans was growing rice, and they was brought from the Senegambia region to South Carolina, and to the South Carolina area primarily, and somewhat North Carolina. And during that time, that is really when the actual slave trade really took a major hold in America. And that is when it went to a whole nother level. When they started talking about something called Carolina gold rice, they brought enslaved Africans from a certain region of Africa because they had the knowledge of growing rice. This picture here shows images of how the United States grew, and it grew because of a major crop called cotton after rice was shifted. Because one thing about growing rice, and people don't always think about this, when you're growing rice, rice is a very harsh agricultural plant when you go to farming. And what I mean by being harsh is when you plant rice on a given field, you have to use a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nutrients, because cotton really is exhausted on the land. And so as you farm cotton, the only way you could get higher and higher yields is you try to expand. And with that, cotton also became a major export for the United States, and it made a lot of individuals, in particular like Great Britain, really wealthy. And so in order to expand the United States, you had a way to move people from the Virginia area through to South Carolina, through the New Orleans area. And what really triggered that particular trade was the Haitian Revolution. Without the Haitian Revolution, New Orleans and the western expansion of the United States wouldn't come into play. And really, the reason New Orleans was so pivotal in the slave trade and growing cotton, New Orleans was a port right at the base of the Mississippi River. And to get people up through the Mississippi Delta into the Black Belt of Alabama, New Orleans was a pivotal slave port, inland slave port during the domestic slave trade, not necessarily during the transatlantic slave trade. So when you look at a lot of people in the New Orleans area, Louisiana area, in the Mississippi area, a lot of those individuals have roots in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and they came through New Orleans, oftentimes some by feet and some by boat, if they came in through the port. And then once they came in through the port of New Orleans, they came in through they went to the inland port of Natchez, Mississippi. And that's where you see a lot of trading of people in the American South. And what this image kind of shows you is how the country grew with their western expansion. And really, King Cotton is what really grew the United States economy. And has formed the foundation of American capitalism. Without cotton, you wouldn't have capitalism. The systems, a lot of the systems you see today are based strongly in the agricultural practice of the South. And if you want to know more about this book, this particular subject, I encourage you to read this book called A Half That's Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste. So this is just a bill of sale, and you probably say, why I'm talking about these things in relation to barbecue. You kind of have to lay a backstory of barbecue of the country to kind of see, like, the very first pictures I show you across the various states. You need to understand the foundation of that so you can see how barbecue traveled. And this here is just a representative bill of sale of enslaved Africans who had a certain knowledge. And the knowledge in this particular slave bill was the sea island cotton and the rice. And if you notice, you see the bills and you see the age, and they identify the different skills they had. Oftentimes, some of the most skilled, some of the highly valued people were the cooks. Also, women had a higher sale because they was being sold for breeding purposes only. So majorly for breeding purposes only. So not only purpose, but a major purpose. So this is just a slave bill in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was I just thought it'd be representative to give you a sample of one today. Next slide. And when looking at the history of American slavery and understanding people coming from, I wanted you all to know a firsthand account, not just me saying that enslaved Africans came up from the Carolinas into the Mississippi to Louisiana. So there's this thing called a WPA slave narratives that during the Great Depression, maybe the government would do something like this now, but I doubt it with the economy to help give jobs. But during the Great Depression, the government interviewed former enslaved people who were children during that time, and they had very interesting narratives. In this particular narrative, you have this man named Mr. James Singleton, who was brought from Charleston, South Carolina. And he was brought down from Charleston with a bunch of other enslaved people. If you know anything about Charleston, South Carolina, some of the most popular last names in the Charleston, South Carolina region are like Singleton, Richardson, Middletons. Those particular names, they have very rich history for Black communities. Of course, we got a name for our enslaved, the people who enslaved us, but those particular names are very prevalent in like the Charleston, South Carolina region. And so when I read this particular narrative, it shows a lot about the connection between Charleston and Mississippi. And you can find narratives just like this where people were brought over as cargo from Charleston, South Carolina to Louisiana. If you know anything about the Georgetown 272, those enslaved people was brought from Virginia as part of the sale to Louisiana. So it's not like it's a myth, it's a real thing. And when people were being sold and brought to Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt, they were bringing the information of their culture or what they experienced in the Virginia areas or South Carolina areas to Louisiana, and then it start evolving further. So at this time, barbecue knowledge traveled in the heads and hands of the individuals because they didn't have no cookbooks. We here today on Zoom, they didn't have Zoom or YouTube or Google. So all the practices that they knew about actually came within their heads and hands. And so most of the cooking, the foodways, the cultural traditions, you could see elements. You may think Louisiana is totally separate from the rest of the South, but you can see things in the Carolinas that are very close in relationship to what you see in Louisiana. And so barbecue knowledge is one of those things that traveled in the heads and hands of enslaved Africans. This is I talked about the domestic slave trade, but I wanted to kind of give you a pictorial representation of the domestic slave trade that I was talking about. And if you see, I was talking about Virginia, how they came down, used the waterways, used the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico to come in through New Orleans. But they also, when they came in through New Orleans, sometimes you would use Mobile and Pensacola as ports to get the inland areas such as Montgomery or Natchez, Mississippi, or Vicksburg. And using the waterways, you're able to get in these port cities such as New Orleans, you're able to help get people into the Delta region or the Black Belt of Alabama or going into Eastern Texas. And so when you see those maps, it all kind of makes sense. And you see the barbecue pictures I presented earlier, you see why all those barbecue pits kind of have the same general flavor and style of construction, because the information came with them. This again is just another map, and you can really look at this map closely. The shaded regions are where the largest populations of enslaved Africans or in their descent. Well, during the 1860s, there was enslaved Africans. You will see the darker regions where the most heavily dominated slave societies. And I'm actually on this particular map, if you look across the South, like Alabama, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, East Texas, you see a red line, and that red line is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was a big gateway to bring people up and down the Mississippi Delta. And you see, if you notice, a lot of enslaved people was heavily congregated up and down the Mississippi River. And not only they were transporting people, but they was also transporting really goods, cargo, cotton, bourbon, tobacco, any sugar cane, anything that was an agriculture-based product, it was actually being shipped up and down the Mississippi River. And so this is just a really good map representation. If you look at these maps, you see a lot of trends. It also helps you to understand things that go on today. While I'm talking about barbecue, if you look at these strong slave-holding states, you also see these slave-holding states. Also, if you look at today's time, the educational system, the economics are generally, the healthcare systems, they almost like some of the worst levels coincide with these maps. So it kind of gives you it's not about the slavery, but sometimes about the mentality of people. But it gives you a little foundation to understand what you may see today in terms of other areas, and then how deeply rooted these things are built into our society and where it actually started from. So I just wanted to kind of share that little tidbit about, if you look at these maps and start thinking about economics and healthcare, you'll see a lot of correlation in the American South. But I love the South, but the South has a lot of good and bad things about it, but I do love it, despite of. For me, I love this barbecue tradition, and I didn't know how far back it went. But in starting to do the research, I realized this was like an enslaved narrative I pulled out of Georgia. And growing up, when we cooked barbecue, we used to slaughter our own animals. And when we slaughter our animals, the actual description in this paragraph where we talk about hog killing time, when we get ready to kill a hog for a barbecue, we had a certain location. Before we actually slaughter the animal, butcher the animal, we would heat the water up in a certain location. And sometimes it's cruel, but we would do this particular technique where we would strike, I didn't do it, my uncle would do it, or my father would do it, where we would strike a hog on his head and then stab it in a knife to be able to bleed it out. And we did that so we could make other recipes called hog's head cheese. But when you look at this narrative, it's almost the exact same process. And once we did all that, then we would actually take the hog and place in a vat of not boiling water, but it would be pretty hot water, probably around 170 degrees, because that helped removing all the hair off of, and you can scrub all the hair off of it and dress the hog out and get it ready for the barbecue. And when I saw this particular narrative, this was just further confirmation that the traditions that I learned as a child growing up, they was deeply rooted in a system of practices that I didn't know that was that far back in time in slavery. But I knew it was a practice of survival. And later on in life, as I got older, what I realized about American slavery just evolved over time in the American South through the sharecropping system. So my grandparents were sharecroppers, and so the traditions that we carried out, they just passed down and they kept going until modern technology eventually replaced some of the practices. Next slide. My first lecture, now in preparing for my first lecture at the Dillard University, the Ray Charles African American Material Culture Program, in preparing for this barbecue lecture, I asked my father one time, what was the barbecue pit that you learned to cook on? Because when we was cooking barbecue as a child, he always talked about cooking whole hogs in the ground. And at that moment, when he drew, so we didn't take any pictures of this process because we took a lot of this stuff for granted growing up. And what I would say was the biggest lesson I have learned about that going forward is in this work of cultural work and wherever you are, even in New Orleans, you need to start trying to document what you can. And whether it's oral, whether it's pictures, because this history is very important. So in preparation for my lecture at Dillard University, I asked my father to draw a sketch of the barbecue pit. In drawing a sketch of the barbecue pit in the ground, I realized quickly that how far back this barbecue tradition went. And as I started looking at the older pictures, I started seeing the direct correlation. So the picture to the left is a sketch of the pit that my father cooked in the ground. And when you evolve barbecue, it started coming above ground in the cinder block pits, refrigerated pits, fuel tanks, brick pits. But the figure to the right is an elderly gentleman cooking barbecue in a pit over tree limbs. And if you look at the sketch my father drew, it has a series of three pipes, where this man cooking his hog on the right has 4 tree limbs. And so you see the direct correlation between historical barbecue, and my father was cooking barbecue like that in 75. So you had better building materials. So you had metal pipes versus tree limbs. And in that, I said, we can't take our culture for granted. And coming to New Orleans really helped me appreciate that, because while I was in the community in South Carolina, I just thought it would last forever. But when I got to New Orleans and I saw other traditions such as second lines or Black Mexican Indian culture, then it helped me realize that I had a very special culture too that I needed to cherish and uplift and make sure it's preserved for the next generation, as well as documenting what I can about it. So other people who may not have the experience or the knowledge that I have can have this for years to come. Barbecue occasions. So we always, no matter where we are, most people across the United States have certain holidays where they like to cook barbecue. One of the biggest ones in the United States is the 4th of July. The 4th of July across many towns and cities across this country today actually have a major barbecue, have barbecues, even though they may be grilling, but grilling and barbecue is being loosely, as I define barbecue, it doesn't necessarily jive with my definition, but for the rest of the world, barbecue and grilling are kind of the same, used, intertwined, and mixing. But other holidays where barbecue showed itself during slavery was during political rallies, weddings, harvest celebrations, and those were the good times. But generally, those good times wasn't always for the enslaved Africans who was doing the cooking. Their occasion for actually doing barbecue came about sometimes during Christmas and the other time when they was, well, I'm gonna say, steal away to the woods. And what I mean by steal away to the woods is when they were cooking barbecue in the South, they were actually on plantation. They would sometimes steal hogs from the plantation owners, and then they'll go into the woods to actually have a barbecue. And that's when they would have their peace and their joy from the difficulties associated with plantation culture. The ideal location for barbecue during the plantation era was generally in a grove of trees in the woods near a flowing stream. And the reason near a flowing stream, because that stream had a variety of uses. It helped keep the meat cool. It was also used to chill watermelons, drinks. It was also used to make different drinks, but it also used to make different soups and stews and punches that go with the actual barbecue and side dishes. So the spring was very important to barbecue tradition in the woods. And so that's, this image to the right is kind of representative of that. But generally on large plantations, when they had these barbecues in the woods, they was generally, for this particular case, they were serving a lot of people. It wasn't for the enslaved community. It was generally for the plantation elite to show their wealth, to try to get political votes, influence, or just really just celebrate their wealth and show off to other individuals. So this is where part of this barbecue tradition lies. Growing up, one of my favorite dishes with barbecue is hash and rice. And what is hash and rice? Hash and rice is a dish when we slaughter animals. And this is something I want people to think about today too. When we sacrifice the animals, every part of the animal should be used. No part of the animal should go to waste. And we would make a dish called hash, which was basically made from the hog head and the organs of that particular animal, delivering the lights. But the enslaved would actually eat all parts of the hog because they also knew that in this hash dish, it was also very nutritional. But in this particular narrative, this is a brief narrative just saying what they would do when they would steal hogs to have a barbecue and what dishes they would make with it. So this stuff is very documented loosely, but I'm trying to tie it all together in some of my future work. The basic barbecue sauce recipe for the day, a lot of people talk about barbecue sauce is very secretive. They are very secretive when you start thinking about the proportions of it. But generally, most barbecue sauces have the same principal base ingredients. And if you think about most barbecue sauces, they have either vinegar, red pepper, salt, some kind of butter or oil, sugar or molasses, not a whole lot, unless you're in certain other regions of the country. And then modern barbecue sauces have these base ingredients, but they also have like mustard, ketchup, some occasional Worcestershire sauce, hot sauces, just any available modern day condiments. And sometimes they have other herbs and spices, but these are just the principal base ingredients for a barbecue sauce. And the enslaved narrative from Wesley Jones out of South Carolina, he described his barbecue sauce recipe. And the reason I said just sugar or molasses, if you know anything about vinegar, when you're cooking with vinegar, some people used to say you want to cut the twang out of vinegar. So you add a little bit of sugar. So I just want to kind of give you why the recipe said just a touch of sugar, because the sugar actually cut the twanginess of the vinegar. Next slide. As good as barbecue sauce is, it also has an equivalent negative side. And one of the most painful things I read when I was reading about maroon cultures, and what is maroons, just because I probably didn't talk about it, but maroons are a group of former enslaved people who often ran away from plantations. But in one description, this in the maroon population, they were describing how the same basic ingredients were for a barbecue sauce were used as additional torture when they whipped enslaved Africans. And they would use vinegar, salt, red pepper, black pepper, and that to increase the pain. It was partially antiseptic, but it was more so to increase the pain for the people, for the enslaved people after they was whipped, and sometimes called pickled. So barbecue, so you think about it, has a very negative side as well. Barbecue woods. When I think about the barbecue woods are important from the standpoint of when you cook barbecue, you generally have three hardwoods you was using. And it was very much dominated by the geographic region of where you're located. You had oak, and then oak was the wood that my family generally used, and we also used a mixture of hickory. Oak was it's a very mild-mannered wood, mild flavored wood when you cook barbecue, but also hickory and pecan was also used, or pecan as some people would say. But the geographic regions have a lot to do with what woods were used, dominated in what we used primarily used in barbecue. But oak, hickory, and pecan were some of the most popular ones. And you never use pine. If you ever hear anybody use pine in cooking barbecue, start running fast. It's just not something you use. The descriptions of old barbecue events. This is just another event from just Wesley Jones saying like how he would cook this animal, who was in attendance, prominent lawyers, and they just enjoy seeing this. They always enjoy seeing Black people cook barbecue, and like I don't know what it's about, but it's just historical, this memory. But Wesley Jones had this memory, and he said how they used to enjoy watching him cook whole goats, whole hogs, sheep, and size of cow. When I was growing up, I didn't know anybody who was cooking whole cows, and part of that reason I believe that many Black families didn't cook whole cows because the resources to cook a whole cow was a lot economically, and also to cook a whole cow, it took a lot of you need a lot of people to eat it, and they were not wasteful people. So the cow was not used. And when I asked my father if he ever heard anybody cooking a barbecue cow, when I went on this journey to cook one, he said when we got rid of our cow, the main purpose of our cow, first and foremost, was for milk. When we got rid of our cow, we generally sold the cow to the slaughterhouse and got a new cow because we needed a new cow for milk. And so they didn't ever really barbecue cows, but hogs was generally the main animal they barbecued when I was coming up. And on occasion, we did goat. Later, I did sheep growing up once I've been in New Orleans. So it's just kind of a recap of all the animals that's been barbecued in the South. During slavery, I mentioned most of them. A shote is a small pig. It's an old term. When they talk about cooking cows, they use three terms: cows, steers, ox. Lambs, sometimes they refer to that in the literature as mutton. Well, lamb is a young sheep, actually. Mutton is a sheep, and a mutton is an older animal, an older sheep, exactly. The other animals they cook that I don't necessarily cook per se on a barbecue pit. I eat rabbit, but I don't cook it on a barbecue pit. But possum and coon, other people have cooked possum. I think I passed on that one. But that was some of the animals. Those are some of the animals they cooked during slavery and post-slavery. The most popular animals were cooking was whole hogs, whole goats, turkeys, and chickens. These images here represent the cultural landscape of what really played a big hand in preserving barbecue traditions in the American South. The top left is people going to the cotton field, and so barbecue is one of those traditions that went with Black farmers. To the bottom left is the church. A lot of churches preserve barbecue traditions for a variety of reasons. One of the popular celebrations that a church have in the South is homecoming. Homecoming was the time of the year where they celebrate the founding date of the church, and during that particular holiday, you'll you'll find a lot of desserts, you'll find a lot of Southern foods being cooked, and you oftentimes find barbecue. That is one of the occasions where in my community, my father used to cook barbecue for my church and my home church growing up for like homecoming. The bottom right is a picnic, and above that is a liquor still. When you think about barbecue, was always another associated thing with barbecue was moonshine culture. And people who really cook barbecue and really know about the culture, you'll always hear people talking about they had a mason jar full of moonshine somewhere near the barbecue pit. It was not necessarily for the people who was actually cooking it, but for the people, for the fellowship and camaraderie around the barbecue pit. That was one of the things to help pass the time throughout the long cooking process from the 10 to 12 hours, sometimes 14 hours of cooking. So these four things really contribute a lot to the preservation of barbecue culture in America. Now we'll come back to Louisiana. I really want to kind of focus. I talked about the Greater South, but I don't necessarily when I first got to Louisiana, people like, does Louisiana really have a barbecue tradition? And I think this is probably one of the first times I'm going to share some of this information in regards to cooking meat traditions in Louisiana. So in Louisiana, the couchon de lait is not the only barbecue tradition in the state. It's very popular, but it's not. And what you see is the figure to the left is couchon de lait, which is the cooking, which is traditionally was known as the cooking of a suckling pig. But and they usually cook it vertically, and it hangs, and you can rotate it. But if you look at this figure to the right, this picture is out of Louisiana. And what they're cooking on is a barbecue pit, except for it's above ground. So this particular picture showed to me that Louisiana had a barbecue tradition. Has a barbecue tradition. And the reason they had a barbecue tradition, because Louisiana was no different than Mississippi or Texas. It had slavery here too. And with people coming in from across the South, they brought that barbecue tradition with them. So here's a picture of somebody barbecuing on a pit in Louisiana. Next one. This picture here came out of Louisiana. This picture here solidified what I believe was barbecue in Louisiana. And the reason I believe this picture is so important because people always talk about a couchon de lait or sometimes cooking pork steak. But if you look at this picture where you see these two white females overlooking this pit, I don't think it was cooking because apparently how they're dressed. But if you look at this particular image, you can see that they're actually cooking above ground in a trench, and you have these wooden tree limbs. You have these wooden tree limbs that actually have wire, and it kind of looks almost like this image in Florida. And if you look at this image and you look at the ones I presented earlier, they almost look identical. So Louisiana has a barbecue tradition. Whether it's celebrated to this day as much, that's a different story, but it has a barbecue tradition. Next slide. Couchon de lait Festival. So the Couchon de lait Festival is held in Mercer, Louisiana. It's something that when times are good, it's definitely something somebody should go check out. And I wanted to learn more about that particular festival, and I went for my first time when I shot an episode of Nourish, but I wanted to kind of see how they did it in the past and how they do it in the future. So in the figure to the left is an old black and white picture from the Couchon de lait Festival. And this man has a stick. I don't know if hopefully it's visible on your screens at home, but I have a red arrow pointing to a device called a rotisserie. Modern innovation helps replace this man from actually have to rotating the hog around the fire with a stick and using an electric motor and a battery. And for the people in New Orleans, the Couchon de lait Festival used to be the second largest festival in the state of Louisiana at one point in time. It got so big they had them shutting it down because it was a little small town. I think my memory is bad, but I think it's about an hour and a half outside of Baton Rouge, north of Baton Rouge. But it's something that definitely people should check out. It's generally Mother's Day every year. But it's a very special tradition. and to be able to see it. I think it's it's definitely practiced by people individuals at home, but it was definitely something to see in this kind of scale and grandeur. So I really think it's something people should check out. This is probably somebody will say cochon de lait. They only think of it as a Louisiana tradition. I have found pictures that verify that the cochon de lait cooking process is not exclusive to Louisiana. The other states that I have found that the cochon de lait has been cooked in Florida, and it looks almost identical. The picture to the left was in Louisiana, but the picture to the right was in Florida. So just so you know, the cochon de lait cooking process, as you describe it, is not just exclusive to Louisiana. A lot of people want to take a lot of credit for that, but this is a picture of New Orleans on Claiborne Street, Smoky Mountain Barbecue, hickory smoke, and they talk about the different things they cooked on. I think it was in the 40s or 50s, I believe. And inside this barbecue restaurant, you'll see a barbecue pit, and we'll show you on the next slide. So inside the image of this particular barbecue restaurant on Claiborne, the figure to the left is the actual picture of the barbecue pit inside the restaurant. And then what I wanted to show you was the hearth kitchen inside the Hermann-Grima. It sort of looks very similar to in construction, how it works. And so I thought it'd be kind of cool just to show you a side-by-side comparison of an old restaurant, even though this restaurant is not as old as the hearth kitchen in the Hermann-Grima house. You still see a lot of semblance in construction and manufacturing, and construction, I mean. So when things open up, be sure to check out the Hermann-Grima house. In moving to New Orleans, the other contributing factor that really got me back involved with cooking barbecue was this festival called Hogs for the Cause. Hogs for the Cause was actually raising money for kids and families fighting pediatric brain cancer. And when I saw the sign up, when I first moved to the Louisiana, New Orleans area, I said, well, this may be a way for me to show what barbecue is to a large group, because I can't cook barbecue at my house and feed that many people. But what I want to say about Hogs for the Cause, I believe, has been a major influencer to New Orleans barbecue culture in one way, even though on the other side of the barbecue culture, we cannot forget the barbecue and grilling cultures that goes with the second line traditions. I see some pretty miraculous things when I go to second lines, especially this one woman I always see cooking. I'm always impressed when I go to a second line, how well she grills and be able to move and go to a new location. So, but I would say Hogs for the Cause is definitely a major influence in New Orleans barbecue culture going forward. To understand the South, understanding the South is critical to understanding the United States. And why I say that is because the South is the oldest region in the United States, and so much of the culture and the landscape, the foodways in particular, were shaped and evolved in the South by enslaved Africans for the most part. You had indigenous communities, and indigenous communities can mix together, but over the years, the enslaved Africans were the ones who was, for the most part, left in a region. But when you start looking at how enslaved Africans, when they start leaving the South after slavery ended with the Great Migration, you start seeing how like the migration paths, whether it's up the eastern seaboard, up from Louisiana, Mississippi, up into Chicago and Detroit, or going up to Michigan, or in the case of Louisiana, where you're also going to the California region. And you can see those food traditions of Louisiana in particular. You can see them in like the California, you can see them in the Chicagos, you can see them in Detroit, but they all follow the Great Migration paths. And I believe the South is very important to understanding them, studying the African contribution. And before, a lot of people talk about going back to Africa, but if you don't really understand the South, you're gonna have a hard time making the correlation between the South and Africa. You're gonna have a hard time making a correlation between the rest of the United States and Africa, because there's so many of the foodways are still prevalent in in the southern United States, even though they look somewhat different, they're still very similar at the same time. So you can't forget about the South when you're trying to understand the U.S., and then you can't forget about West Africa if you want to understand it further. One person who really sheds a lot of light on this and the foodways, and I wish he would write more on the foodways, would be Dr. Ibrahim Asek. But he wrote a book called Buki Fe Kumbo, and he had one chapter in particular about the foodways, and what the work he's doing is something I have a lot of respect for him, because he's doing a lot of work to make sure the enslaved contributions are recognized in Africa, but he also is able to tie it to his home heritage from Senegal, but he's very knowledgeable. But he has a really good chapter in this particular book about foodways, culture, and I'm looking forward to any work that he's put out. And he's somebody I think you all should look at, research, and read his book, read his work. He does a lot of scholarly work, and he does a lot of great research too. African, this is kind of a bonus. I know I talked about barbecue for the beginning, but I wanted to make sure I at least talk about some things that was near and dear to me, and why I really started looking at this foodways when I got to Louisiana. We're looking at living close to Charleston, not in Charleston, but being familiar with certain dishes, and then getting to Louisiana and seeing things. I'm like, what are the commonalities, and where are those commonalities coming from? And I knew they was rooted in Africa. So if you tell me what you eat, I will tell you who you are. As I said earlier, land is tied to the culture, and pretty much culture is preserved when you're tied to some land. And why I say that in particular is in Charleston, they have the dish called red rice. In Louisiana, they have jambalaya. This dish is related together as a dish called jollof rice. And when I saw those dishes, I knew they had a deeper connection. And in Louisiana, this is something that it was kind of, the African influence in the pot was something that really kind of, it's very strong in the pot, but it's often not celebrated like it should be. And I believe it has undergone a lot of misappropriation as well as elimination. And the reason I say that is in Louisiana like to talk about Creole cultures and Cajun cultures. Cajun culture is a term that's been brought out by the Tourism Corporation for marketing purposes. And when you start looking at, when people start celebrating Cajun culture, they say we was in the Acadiana region. When the people from the Acadiana region always says that they came from Canada. So if you go back to Canada from Louisiana and you can't see the food, where did the food come from? And that's one question I ask. The other question I ask is if Cajun food is in Canada, it should be some remnants of there. But if one go to West Africa, you can taste the spices, you can see the ingredients, and you can see semblances of classic one-pot dishes that you can see an instant connection. And so when you start looking at these ingredients and start dissecting them further, you really start to nail home on what's going on in the cultures of Louisiana. Particularly, let's start with rice just for starters. Rice is a dish, is an ingredient that was primarily found in African and Asian cultures only. Due to science, the science tells you that when you breed an African breed rice and an Asian rice, it becomes sterile, so you can't reproduce. So because of that, you know that rice, it was grown on the continent of Africa, and rice was grown in Asia. Rice is processed using a mortar and pestle. Other ingredients that are particular to West Africa that you see a lot in Louisiana food, you see a lot of okra. And the okra, you see, is a thickener. Some people don't like it, but it's a thickener that enslaved Africans brought over they brought over with them when they came to the United States. Other dishes, peanuts. I talked about jollof rice earlier, black-eyed peas, and watermelon, and gumbo. All of these things are they're very deep in the African culture. And you can't find some of these ingredients that I'm talking about in Canada. I really like this particular slide when you start talking about the mortar and pestle, and I want to kind of delve into this because the mortar and pestle, as I mentioned earlier, when I talk about briefly mentioned the Carolina gold rice, enslaved Africans had this knowledge of growing and cultivating rice before they came to the New World. So the figure to the left shows people in a village in West Africa pounding and hulling rice using a mortar and pestle in tandem. Then when you get to the United States, you see this picture taken here in the middle in Sapelo Island, Georgia, of these two people grinding and pounding a mortar and pestle. If you look at the shape of these mortar and pestle, they have a particular purpose. One end is pointed and one end is rounded. And the reason those ends are rounded and pointed because one end is used for hulling and one end is used for polishing. Then there's this image to the right that kind of strikes me. They have a Acadiana woman in Louisiana. And when you look at this particular picture, you wonder who did she learn how to grind rice from? Yes, they grow a lot of rice in Louisiana, but a lot of the information that was transferred from West Africa to the United States was transferred by enslaved Africans on how to process and cultivate as well as grow rice. So we have to really think about the enslaved Africans' contribution to the rice cultivation. They were also to building the foundation of the American South. Thank you for your time this evening. I look forward to any questions you may have. If you want to contact me, you could contact me at Howard Conyers, my Twitter handle, Instagram, my website, other websites for the event, as well as the past show I did at PBS. But these are the best ways to contact me if you want to see some of my other work. Thank you.
Amazing, Dr. Conyers. Amazing.
Thank
So,
you.
oh my gosh, I'm blown away. Let me get a moment to collect myself. Amazing. So that means that I don't I don't barbecue at home. I grill, but I get my good barbecue from specialty restaurants. So
Okay.
that's
All
what
right.
I've learned, amongst other things. So I don't barbecue, I grill.
You can technically grill, you're right.
So at this time, if you have any questions, we ask that you just submit your questions to either the Q&A or in the chat, and then to myself, to the panelists, and we will facilitate questions with Dr. Conyers. So I'll just start with the first question, and as Dr. Conyers and I go back and forth, I encourage you all to submit your questions to the Q&A. So my first question for you, Dr. Conyers, is what made you start cooking barbecue again, along with this, what made you want to do the historical background versus just being a pit master and going on Food Network, try to enter all these contests, doing that? But what made you want to include the scholarship on it, that particular culinary history piece? Okay,
so the first part I would answer, because living in New Orleans, I got homesick, and to get a taste of home, the only way I could get a taste of home that I wanted, and I wanted barbecue, was to actually cook the barbecue that I grew up with. But what really drove me to the scholarship point of view is Fox News came out with a story in 2015, I think, time frame, and they listed America's most influential pitmasters. And on that list, they didn't have any African Americans. Several rebuttals came out after that, and the rebuttals said that enslaved Africans had a strong hand in developing American barbecue. And as I start looking at old pictures, I start looking at how the animals look, and they look like how, when I was growing up, they looked identical. When we butterfly and flatten them out, we flatten them out and put them on a pit. And when I saw that and I started looking into the literature, I read a lot of enslaved narratives, and I read a lot of other books and the contributions, it was very scarce. And the reason it was scarce is because most of the accounts for the enslaved people were, they was omitted, but they wasn't actually able to read or write. So they had to cook their own. They had to, so I was a guardian of that tradition. So a lot of the oral history, I could fill in almost every blank that I read in the actual description of barbecue. And so that is why I started down the path of really taking a scholarship. And the final reason I took this scholarship path was because I could be a source of oral history, but I knew people would try to challenge me, even though I have a PhD in engineering, like, could you back up your oral history? So I went down the path that said, I want to back up the oral history that I know within text. So if anybody ever tried to challenge me, I could almost go to any book. I could go to like, probably got 10 or 15 books that I can find passages, even they may not be complete, but then I can say I validated this test by actually cooking these animals using this technique. And so I said, I'm gonna add the academic rigor to it, being an engineer. And I actually took that methodology of like I hypothesize or I did field validations to go along with the literature review. And that was something I learned as an engineer going to get my doctorate, and I translated that to barbecue. And I felt that was important to give a complete story. And the people before me deserve that kind of treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Conyers. I'll just continue to move on to the next question. So you stated that enslaved Africans would do these barbecues by the stream to cool meat. I'm just reading it verbatim.
Okay.
Why would they need to cool or chill the meat?
It was more to kind of keep the meat cool before cooking. Because if you think about it, in the summertime, you killing an animal, that animal could spoil really quick before you actually put it on a barbecue pit. But generally, it was very little time that lapsed. In the wintertime, a barbecue could have been more forgiving if you did it outside. But in the summertime, the 4th of July, or say August, when you have these barbecue events, the outdoor temperature is very brutal. They didn't have refrigeration. So the cool water was a way to help keep the meat somewhat cool so that meat wouldn't spoil so quick before putting it on the barbecue pit. But generally, there was a very little time gap between killing the animal and putting it on the barbecue pit. Very little.
Thank you. So next question. Is the tradition of barbecuing using the ground non-existent amongst African Americans today? If so, do you think or know if it is because it is more time or labor intensive?
So the reason the tradition of barbecuing the ground is pretty much gone away is better technology, better innovation comes come around, you do better. So the pit in the ground, you can make that same pit above ground using cinder blocks or a refrigerator or a fuel tank. So there's no need to dig a pit in the ground just for the sake of cooking barbecue. The other reason you don't cook a pig in the ground anymore is if you were serving that for the public, the health codes wouldn't allow you to cook an animal in the ground. And also, when you're cooking in the ground, and if you're in Louisiana, you'll really appreciate this. The water table gets high, depending on where you're located at. And so if the water table is high, you can't cook barbecue in the ground at 2 feet deep.
I saw a slide that mentioned persimmon beer. Persimmon beer. And then you mentioned moonshine. Was there a tradition of brewing among enslaved people in the South?
Oh, it was brewing beer was a tradition in the enslaved community. Persimmon beer was quite common. It's deeper than that, because if you go back if people go to Africa and you look into the pyramids, you will see people brewing beer inside the pyramid. They have pictures or images inside the pyramids of people brewing beer. And so making beer was in the slide, was very prevalent inside the enslaved community. When I went to Ghana this past year, they was making something called palm wine. I forgot they made which was actually a distillation process. And then they have I can't think of the spirit they call, but basically they take palm sap and they ferment it and they distill it. And in a way, that almost palm sap is a sugar. And if you think about palm sap being a sugar, that's no different than using sugarcane sap as a sugar, and you ferment that to make rum. And so they had another product in Ghana. I can't remember the name of it right now. I think Okaru, I believe that's the name of it, which is clear liquid, which is almost would be just like rum before you age it in a barrel. So there's a lot of traditions of know-how. The still that I saw was very crude in Africa, but fundamentally from the science point of view, it works.
Thank you. So is your favorite style of barbecue Carolina style? What's your second favorite?
I think my favorite is always Carolina style because, and I generally like to say it's Southern style now because that barbecue was seen across the South, even though it's only in Carolina today. And that's because I grew up eating that barbecue. If I had to say another style of barbecue I kind of generally like, I kind of like, I don't really want to call it barbecue, but Korean barbecue is really good.
It is. Is the mortar and pestle related to a paddle used to mix big pots of jambalaya?
No, there's two totally different purposes. The mortar and pestle is just mainly for processing the rice or grains or grinding seasonings. The paddle is just something for stirring. Two different purposes.
Thank you. Why are there such passionate differences in rubs, sauces, and flavorings in barbecue? And do you have theories or anecdotes?
So the reason rubs and stuff are so passionate now, like media is very popular. Media makes barbecue this whole new sport, I would say, almost like it's a football team. Just like people get real passionate about whether the Saints or LSU, like rubs and regions are something, a newfound tradition, a new thing that came about in about the 60s, somewhere between the 40s and 60s, where you start seeing barbecue evolve from whole animals to start going into the regions. Once you start moving away from farmland, the barbecue style, the regionalization really started coming into effect. Anecdotes for actually making the rubs, I think like anything. I mean, if you have the ability to make it better by using seasonings and rubs, I mean, that's great. But I think one thing you should not try to do is, I see sometimes people try to do too much with seasonings and rubs. And an example of that is, I don't know an example of that, but sometimes I see people try to do too much with it, and it overpowers the whole animal and the whole meat. And I think you're covering up the essence of the animal, but also that partly goes to how the animal is raised. If the animal is raised in a better way, then I think you wouldn't need as much seasonings to cover up like commodity hogs or commodity animals.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Conyers. You mentioned that carrying on of traditions is always tied to the land. How do you see legacy and tradition of whole hog barbecue being carried on today? And is it still tied to land, or is it through scholarship, documentation, etc.?
So I think it's waning because of the land ownership. It's waning because people are not farming. So I believe it's very important that it is documented and archiving various forms. I mean, I went through extensive efforts to make sure it's documented in visual media because let's be honest, a lot of people don't read anymore. So they're more tend to find it on YouTube, but visual media is not I guess you would say a classic form that will last forever. So I know that I need to put some of this knowledge I have onto like pencil and on paper because it won't last. It won't endure on visual form forever, like YouTube. But it will last a long time, a lot longer and more people will probably pay attention to it than it's in a book, unless they're really passionate about it.
Thank you. do you have a preference, a preferred wood that you use?
I prefer oak. I prefer water oak or live oak. Those are just kind of two woods that I grew up with, but also when I talk about oak wood, like I also talk about seasoning of wood. And what I mean by seasoning of wood, like I don't go cut a tree today and use it tomorrow. I may cut a tree today and cook with that wood, and say it may have to season for 3 or 4 months before I want to cook with it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that. Will you be investigating indigenous barbecue methods and the intersection of your research?
So I did look at the indigenous contributions of how they cook meat. I don't call it barbecue. Indigenous methods of meat and what they did with meat was more of a preservation technique. They cooked on something called a buchan and hurdles, and it was basically a smoke preservation process. And I have looked at it, and I have tried to like correlate it to American barbecue. What I will say about the indigenous contributions to American barbecue is what I could accurately say for sure, because I also went to Trinidad and looking at the Caribbean. They have similar structures of how they did meat preservation. But what I would say about in terms of American barbecue in the South in particular, one of the things in the indigenous community I think I could easily point to is the use of certain cooking woods. The indigenous community knew for sure what woods would cook well and what wood would give you a better heat. And so I believe they're fundamentally responsible for telling enslaved Africans or showing enslaved Africans what woods to use, such as oak or hickory. But for the actual buccaneering or barbacoa is something totally different than barbecue. I think we have to really be careful, and I'm sorry to be doing so long with this answer, but I think we have to be really careful when we talk about words. We need to focus on the technique associated with the word, because sometimes you can take words and bend them and co-opt them to mean different things, but the technique is where we have to put a lot of emphasis on. And what I did with thinking about the techniques that the indigenous community used, and I started thinking about their early plantation barbecues for 400 or 500 people. When you're cooking over a live fire, there's no way somebody can control cooking 10 to 15 animals at a time with small fires underneath them. So I wrote a whole little treatise on it. I never publicly shared it, but I want to think about it from as a cook and the science is what is practical. And so that's the reason I'm kind of really careful about how I say indigenous contributions on barbecue. And I thought some of it should have been, if the indigenous did a barbecue tradition that was similar to what I see in American barbecue, it should have been some resemblance of it on some of the reservations somewhere across the country. But I haven't really heard anybody talk about in any of the reservations. But I'm interested in going to find out if somebody have a lead for me to go to. I'll clearly go down that path and look at it.
Thank you. Okay, let me look. Okay, so so a lot of, some of these questions are related, so I'll ask that a little bit later. So let's start with this. Because I can ask one question to ask 3 questions. So let me just one that's not related to that sort of theme. Okay, my old geography professor at LSU studied barbecue in South Carolina and the Southeast. He noted the regional variation in sauce preferences and the meat that comprises most barbecue. Have you looked at these variations, and do you have any thoughts on how and why they developed?
So let me start with that. So most barbecue sauces across the American South were the same up to a certain point. They all was a vinegar pepper based barbecue sauce, and that was the oldest barbecue sauce in the country, in the U.S. South. Then as commercial condiments came on the scene, such as mustard and tomato or Worcestershire sauce, those ingredients start being placed into the sauce pot. the regionalizations really started coming when people start leaving the land, whether Kansas City. If you look at Kansas City, for example, people talk about Kansas City barbecue. One of the very most famous pit masters or cooks that came out of Kansas City is Henry Perry. Henry Perry came from Tennessee, and he was cooking pit cook barbecue in Tennessee. When I look at like pit cook barbecue, what I did recently, I didn't talk about it in this particular talk, was I traveled from South Carolina. I went to Eastern North Carolina. And in Eastern North Carolina and Eastern South Carolina, the barbecue traditions are pretty much the similar, almost identical. But then I went to Marietta, Arkansas, and I found this place in the Arkansas Delta, which is almost identical. The technique they use is almost identical to what you would see in the Carolinas. And even from the barbecue pits to the barbecue sauce purposes. But really the regionalizations came when people start leaving and start going into cities. And after a while, I mean, like, I'm not a strong vinegar pepper based person, because sometimes vinegar, when you're cooking with a vinegar based barbecue sauce, it doesn't go well with like cooking on chicken, because with vinegar pepper based barbecue sauce is very watery. So therefore you add other ingredients to make it thicker so you could put it onto chicken or ribs, because otherwise it'll just run off. But for whole animal cooking, a vinegar pepper based sauce can go right through it. Because that barbecue sauce is also carrying the seasonings in it. Hopefully I answer your question.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'll ask this one last question, and then there's like maybe 3 questions that's basically the same theme, and I'll just end it off with that one. So this is the last question before the theme of the last topic. So on your trip to Nigeria, Ghana, and Cape Verde, did you have an aha moment about the correlation between Southern and West African foodways? Could you elaborate on your trip experience, since Africa is always mentioned last when mentioning the contributions of Southern foodways?
So when I went to Cape Verde, I give one in each country. Cape Verde, when I was in Cape Verde, we like cracklings. People like cracklings in Louisiana. We like cracklings in South Carolina. When I was in the markets in Cape Verde, they had cracklings there too. And that was a direct correlation. Cape Verde is one of the slave countries that had slavery that a lot of people don't talk about, but it was actually probably the most monumental one, because it was the first place to have plantation culture. That was kind of like development ground for the Portuguese. And like, I would say, in Senegal, when I had something called yassa poulé, when I saw yassa poulé, it almost reminded me of smothered chicken. Smothered chicken, where people would have smothered chicken with like gravy and onions. And so I saw those correlations pretty much like right away. And I think like it just wasn't a food tradition that I'm going to bring up next. But growing up as a child, my grandmother used to like sweep the yard with a broom. And I used to thought it was the craziest of things. But when I got to West Africa, I saw plenty women like bending over, sweeping the ground with a broom in almost the same exact manner as my grandmother. And when I saw that, I knew that that was a deep correlation, because I didn't know where she got that tradition from. I just thought it was just like, I thought, because growing up, we used to have to cut the grass. I'm like, grandma, your grass, we're not going to be able to cut anything if you just sweep the grass and you just see dirt. But it was definitely, when I saw it, was a West African tradition. I mean, I saw it in every country. I saw it in Nigeria, I saw it in Ghana, I saw it in Cape Verde, and I saw it in Senegal. So it's just something that came over.
That's amazing.
I mean,
you can go.
No, I really didn't know where that tradition came from. I just thought my grandmother was like crazy for doing that. But if you look at a lot of older people in the South, a lot of people across the South, if you talk to any older people, they will tell you, oh, we sweeping the yard.
So these last questions, thank you, Dr. Conyers. These last questions, they're all related. So I'm going to read them, but they're all related to the same theme. So what So they're essentially this: what are your future plans with barbecue in your research? The other related question: will your future research involve comparing barbecue methods, techniques for the North and South? What sort of, or have you come across any written accounts of indigenous tribes barbecuing? And then the last question is, what primary sources can you recommend for a novice researcher? So, what are your future plans for your barbecue research? Where is this going with it? What, will it involve comparing barbecue methods, techniques for the North and South, written accounts of indigenous tribes, and then what sources, primary sources, can you recommend for a novice researcher?
So I'm gonna start with the last one. Couple of books on barbecue. I think is one of my favorite books is called Virginia Barbecue by Joseph Haynes, and it gives a lot of those different cultures mixing, and also gives a good overview. And it's a really easy read. The next book I would say would be it's by Robert Moss, The History of Barbecue and Institution. Those are the two books that I know that's available on the shelf right now. There's a couple other works coming out next year. I think, so in regards to comparing the North and South, I am going to look at barbecue. I'm going to do a talk one day on like barbecue and following the Great Migration path. Personally, I'm just kind of give it to you. I'm gonna kind of break down, like, I'm gonna use Chicago as an example. I'm gonna break that down to the south side of Chicago and tie it back to Southern barbecue, with the migratory path. For its future work, my future work in barbecue, like, I really need to spend a lot of time documenting it, taking a lot of stuff out my head so I don't take it to the grave with me. And the countless oral stories. So like some of the things I've been doing like unofficially on the side is when I go home, I try to interview elders who talk about I try to interview elders in the community. And I want to eventually do a few elders across the South in farming communities. They might be 70, 80, 90 years old, and just record their audio stories, because one thing I realized when I talk to these elders, we all talk the same language. We all talk English, but when I talk barbecue, I can use certain phrases that only they know and only I know, and they know that I come up in that culture. So I want to take my knowledge and make sure it's recorded so their voices are heard. I'm in the process of working on a coffee table book, because I want to kind of give people a pictorial representation of barbecue through my eyes and what I have seen and what I have experienced, but also through some of my research, would be in a way where it's easy for people to pick up and fairly quick and have a good conversation about. And for the indigenous communities, like, I've been looking for indigenous communities who have a barbecue tradition. I haven't had much success. I don't know if that because I don't personally identify with the indigenous community, and so maybe they may be really guarded on traditions. And the reason I say they may be guarded on traditions, even when I'm talking to my own communities, I really have to show them that I'm really trustworthy to give information to, so they know it won't end up in the wrong hands. And two, there's a certain level of trust when you start talking about cultural practices, because so many times people have been taken advantage of and exploited. They are very, you kind of have to get to know people on certain things before they share traditions freely with you. So that I'm open to looking at indigenous communities. I just haven't have a strong relationship with some people enough to really have that conversation. I haven't really seen it, but I have traveled to try to find linkages, and I will travel. Like, I don't mind traveling. Right now I do mind traveling. When things get back to somewhat a normal, maybe next year, like, I will travel to other places and do more research if somebody give me a good lead on indigenous communities and barbecue.
Wow, Dr. Conyers, listen. Yeah, I'm blown away. I'm blown away. Thank you so much. This conversation can go on and on. So this is all the time that we have. We won't have time for Dr. Conyers to take any more questions, but this was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Conyers, for
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope I
sharing
gave you all something.
and your labor. I can tell this is a labor of love and very, very well researched. So we want to thank you for bestowing this very, very important knowledge on us. I learned so much, I can't even begin. And thank you all. You asked incredible questions, which made for an even better discussion. So we are extremely grateful to be able to offer this programming to you all again. Please, if you want, become a member so that you can continue to support this type of programming. So without further ado, again, Dr. Conyers, thank you so much. And
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
have a